I am really excited to introduce our first speaker of the panel, who is Jonathan Kalmuss-Katz. Jonathan is a senior attorney with the Environmental Justice in their Toxic Exposure and Health team. Jonathan is currently engaged in several matters involving PFAS, including a lawsuit brought on behalf of national and community organizations challenging the Department of Defense incineration contracts for PFAS-containing waste. He's also working on cases related to EPA's evaluation and regulation of other harmful substances under the Toxic Substances Control Act and the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, known as FIFRA. Jonathan, turning it over to you.
Thank you for having me. I'm John Kalmuss-Katz from Earthjustice, and I just wanted to quickly begin by thanking the Cancer-Free Economy Network, CHEJ, and the Sierra Club for putting on this symposium, this workshop, and to everybody who's attended. When I started working on my first PFAS disposal matter a little bit more than 2.5 years ago, this was not a topic that anybody was discussing. People were aware of PFAS, people were aware of the incredible risks that PFAS were posing and the harm they were causing to communities with contaminated drinking water and contaminated soil. And there was very little discussion of what to do with the PFAS that surround us, what to do with the firefighting foam, the PFAS-containing products, the remediation wastes that were being generated. And I think over the last couple of years, we've really started to see kind of tremendous progress, which is working its way through the courts, through kind of state legislatures, through federal Congress. And I'm excited about this moment and the opportunity to build on that and to do even more. So that is the theme of my presentation, which is regulating PFAS disposal under federal law, moving from promise to progress. I wanted to begin by briefly discussing the main federal laws that regulate waste treatment and disposal. So the first one, and probably the biggest one, is the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, or RCRA. And that provides what is—
John, can I pause you? We can't see your slides, so just want to make sure you—
Oh, no. Let me see.
Sommer can share them.
Okay,
sorry.
thank you.
I went to
now we can see them.
Thank you.
Oh, okay. So thank you, Sommer. Let me go back to the slide that I was on. And now actually, let me, sorry, find the version with my notes. Okay. So as I was saying, the main federal law regulating the disposal and treatment of waste is the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or RCRA. RCRA provides for what is called cradle to grave regulation of hazardous waste. So storage, transportation, treatment, and disposal. It's a fairly kind of detailed regulatory system, but it only applies to wastes that are considered or regulated as hazardous. There is limited regulation of non-hazardous solid waste, but that is largely left to the states, and it's not nearly as protective or comprehensive. There's also the Clean Air Act, which I think people are aware of. It's not a waste statute per se, but it does establish emission standards and operating requirements for many types of waste disposal facilities. So incinerators, in addition to complying with the hazardous waste law, RCRA, will also have to comply with air emission standards in their Clean Air Act permits. Then there is the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, also known as CERCLA, or the Federal Superfund Law. This is the main federal law governing the remediation of contaminated sites, contaminated soil, contaminated sediment in rivers, etc. People are aware, I think, of federal Superfund sites. The law actually is much broader than that. Anytime that any party incurs costs associated with the cleanup of a hazardous substance, they can use this statute to sue the party that is responsible for that contamination. So this is something where, in kind of an ideal world where PFAS are covered, and I'm going to get to that in a moment, but people that are conducting remediation, kind of water treatment facilities based on other parties' pollution, can use CERCLA, and it's a very powerful law, because it does not require a showing of fault or liability. Just if somebody has released the hazardous substance, they are strictly liable for the cleanup costs. And then finally, you have the last statute here, which is the Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA. TSCA really governs the entire life cycle of non-pesticide chemicals, from manufacturing, use, and disposal. Any new chemicals that come to market need to go through an approval process under TSCA, or at least many of them do. And that includes many PFAS chemicals. There are hundreds of PFAS that have been approved under TSCA in recent decades. And TSCA also, and I'm going to talk about this in a minute, provides some possibility for regulating PFAS disposal. We can go to the next slide, please. So these are the federal laws that have effectively regulated PFAS treatment and disposal. And this slide has a lot less on it than the last one. Unfortunately, while there's a lot of potential with existing federal law, I think there are laws that can be used. Thus far, their kind of implementation and enforcement has not resulted in effective PFAS regulation. And I think the main reasons for that are PFAS are not listed as hazardous waste under RCRA. PFAS are not considered to be hazardous air pollutants under the Clean Air Act. PFAS are not regulated as hazardous substances under the Superfund law, under CERCLA. And under the Toxic Substances Control Act, PFAS regulation has been incredibly piecemeal and out of date. So you have these laws, you have these statutes on the books that are designed to protect the public from the impacts associated with toxic waste treatment and disposal. And none of those laws have really been fully brought to bear to regulate and effectively protect the public from PFAS. And I think that is the huge problem that we're confronting now. You have these tools that are available and none of them have been used to the best of their ability. Next slide, please. So there are efforts underway to change that and to make use of all of the laws that I just mentioned. Under RCRA, the hazardous waste law, there are petitions that were submitted to EPA from peer public employees for environmental responsibility, I believe, the UC Berkeley Law School and the state of New Mexico, 3 separate petitions to list PFAS as hazardous waste. And last October, in response to the New Mexico petition, EPA did propose listing 4 specific PFAS, PFOA, PFOS, PFBS, and GenX, as hazardous constituents. It's actually not a hazardous waste listing, but it is the first step towards a hazardous waste listing. So there are efforts underway to try and make better use of this RCRA regulatory authority. And I think, unfortunately, this process could, just to get the contaminants listed, spend several years. I mean, they have solicited public comment on the hazardous constituent designation. After doing that, they would have to consider and respond to the comments, finalize that designation, and then undertake a separate process to propose a hazardous waste listing. So this isn't something that is going to happen kind of in the immediate future. And at the end of that process, the true test will be the regulations that EPA drafts to regulate PFAS disposal under RCRA. Because under RCRA, I mean, the main methods of disposal right now, even for hazardous waste, are landfilling and incineration. Now you have to go to certain landfills, kind of the number of landfills that you can send hazardous waste to is smaller than the number of landfills that you could send non-hazardous waste to, and same, there are only certain kind of incinerators that are authorized to accept hazardous waste. But there's no evidence that even those authorized permitted facilities are going to be capable of effectively treating PFAS. So I think once you get a hazardous waste listing, the key step will be to ensure that EPA drafts regulations that make sure we're not just using the same hazardous waste incinerators that we've used for everything else when we know that PFAS are different, that we're not just sending it to hazardous waste landfills, but that we actually have tailored disposal solutions that we know will work for PFAS. Under the Superfund law, there is currently a rulemaking underway. It hasn't actually been proposed yet, but the proposal is currently, I believe, before the White House Office of Management and Budget. So it's working its way through the regulatory process that would list certain PFAS as hazardous substances under CERCLA. I believe they're just starting with PFOA and PFOS. So it's an incredibly small subset of the thousands of PFAS that exist. That listing would facilitate the remediation of those substances. It would make it easier to recover funds for PFAS remediation, or at least for PFOA and PFOS remediation. But that actually adds to urgency to these disposal issues that we're facing. because the more cleanup that is underway, the more PFAS contaminated soil that is being generated, the more PFAS treatment waste that are being generated. That's all important. Kind of basically, we should be getting PFAS out of our soil and we should be treating drinking water. We need to do that. But we also then need a method to ensure that you're not just shipping the PFAS contaminated soil to an incinerator where it's then entering the community surrounding the incinerator. Same with the waste treatment filters. And one thing which is notable, one other thing that I'll mention about the Superfund listing, the hazardous substance listing, is that the National Waste and Recycling Association and the Solid Waste Association of North America, which represent landfills and other waste disposal facilities, they're already seeking an exemption from Superfund liability, essentially from this listing, for municipal solid waste landfills. So they haven't even released a proposal yet. And the waste kind of trade associations have already lobbied Congress to say, you know what, the PFAS come from somebody else, so if it's in our leachate, don't hold us responsible, don't blame us, don't require us to contribute to the costs. So that is a process that will continue to play out as that listing moves forward. Sorry, let me here. The Clean Air Act, that's another really important kind of statute where in order to effectively kind of protect communities surrounding incinerators, in order to protect communities surrounding industrial facilities that release PFAS into the air, it's not enough just to focus on the waste statutes. You also need to ensure that the air permits are strong, that the regulatory kind of Clean Air Act side is working as well. And I expect that we will see efforts to list PFAS as hazardous air pollutants and bring them subject to Clean Air Act jurisdiction in the future. There was recently the first hazardous air pollutant was just added by EPA last year in response to a citizen petition. It's the first time that has happened in decades. So there is precedent for this. And I think it is an important kind of next step when we're talking about PFAS regulation and PFAS disposal regulation. And then finally, on the Toxic Substances Control Act side, EPA, when it has approved many existing PFAS under TSCA, it has done so pursuant to consent orders. So it will impose specific requirements that, yes, you could bring this PFAS to market, but you have to do X, Y, and Z. And many of those consent orders, they're known as Section 5E orders, actually have provisions related to disposal. They prohibit incineration, or they otherwise regulate PFAS disposal. Those orders, they don't cover the full universe of PFAS, but they are an effective means of potentially kind of addressing the disposal of the PFAS that are subject to the orders. And there are hundreds of them. But what happens is the orders often, they were entered decades ago, they're out of date, they're not very strong, and nobody ever goes back to look to strengthen them and change them. So we've been calling on EPA to do that, to take a look at all of the existing consent orders for previously approved PFAS under TSCA to determine whether they are actually protective of public health, and then to revise them as needed. And EPA has actually said that it plans to do that. Thus far, we have not seen any action on that front yet. Next slide, please. So without the ordinary kind of litigation hooks, kind of if PFAS were regulated as hazardous waste, as hazardous substances under the Clean Air Act, you would have a lot of opportunities to hold EPA responsible to the requirements of those laws and to potentially sue parties that have been violating those laws. We're not there yet. So when we were looking at how, as lawyers, we can try and challenge kind of irresponsible PFAS disposal, PFAS incineration of the Department of Defense's firefighting foam, the AFFF, that contains PFAS, we had to look to other existing environmental laws. And we did that on behalf of the Sierra Club and 3 organizations surrounding hazardous waste incinerators: Save Our County in East Liverpool, Ohio, United Congregations of Metro East. Cheryl's on this panel and she'll be speaking a little bit later, in the Metro East region of Illinois, and Community Empower and Development Association in Port Arthur, Texas. And that lawsuit, which is currently kind of pending before the courts, challenged initially 3 large-scale PFAS incineration contracts. DoD has since canceled 2 of those. There's 1 contract remaining in that suit. And there are 2 main arguments that we have raised in opposition to those contracts. The first is that when it entered those contracts, the Department of Defense never considered the impacts on the surrounding communities. It did not conduct any sort of environmental review. And there is a federal law, the National Environmental Policy Act, that we believe requires that review. That law, NEPA, says that whenever a federal agency takes any action that may affect public health or the environment, may have a significant adverse effect, it has to consider the impacts on the environment. It has to look at potential mitigation measures, and it has to look at alternatives. And none of that was done here. DoD rushed into these contracts without any sort of environmental analysis. We've challenged that as unlawful. And there also is another statute, which I'm going to mention on my next slide, or actually in a couple of slides, but 2 years ago in a military spending bill, Congress, largely because the other environmental laws had not yet been effectively used to regulate PFAS, they imposed some of their own restrictions on DoD's PFAS incineration. This was a bill that was known as the National Defense Authorization Act, or the NDAA, for fiscal year 2020. And what that bill said is that before DoD incinerates any PFAS, it has to comply with certain conditions. It has to ensure that the temperatures of the incinerator are sufficient to break down the PFAS and to minimize emissions to the maximum extent practicable. And it has to do so, there are other requirements that Congress imposed to ensure that DoD was limiting the effects and the harms caused by PFAS incineration. And frankly, given the information that exists now, I don't think there's any way that DoD can make those certifications, just because it does not have sufficient information to know whether any of these incinerators are actually breaking down PFAS. So DoD has thus far taken absolutely no steps to comply with those requirements. It has ignored the NDAA for the last 2 years. And that's another claim that we have brought in this lawsuit. Next slide, please. So, as I said, we filed this lawsuit almost 2 years ago, I think. The lawsuit has gone through 2 courts. It is still pending. We don't have a decision yet. But just filing the lawsuit and I think in the intervening period and organizing around the lawsuit has made a significant difference. One thing that it did is it drew public attention to this issue. So there are these articles, there's one from the Wall Street Journal and another from a trade publication, but being in court, again, it's not just a litigation strategy, it is an organizing strategy, it is a press strategy, and it is a policy and lobbying strategy that all work together. So here we've seen since people became aware of it, since these stories started coming out on the harms associated with PFAS incineration, you had New York enact a ban on the incineration of at least firefighting foam containing PFAS at an incinerator in upstate New York outside of Albany. It's actually a cement kiln that had been accepting just massive, unbelievable quantities of PFAS containing foam from DoD and elsewhere. You had on the bottom left corner here, several members of Congress from Illinois, the 2 senators, Duckworth and Durbin, and then Representative Bustos, write a letter to the EPA Region 5 administrator raising concerns about the incineration of PFAS at an incinerator in Sauget, Illinois, in the Metro East area. You had hazardous waste disposal facilities themselves, the companies that own the incinerators, started saying, we don't want to take this because, first of all, we don't know what's going to happen. And also just, we don't want to be the next story, the next organizing target. So I think that even within the industry, and that isn't to say there aren't companies that are still happy to take it, but you have seen fissures and you have seen divisions as this has drawn more attention and has become more of a controversial issue and an issue that people are talking about and aware of. Next slide, please. And then surprisingly, I think there actually has been meaningful action in Congress, which is not something that you think of, at least in recent years. It's obviously a very polarized Congress, and it's hard for kind of people to work together on many environmental issues. Here you have had two bills, both part of these broader spending bills, the National Defense Authorization Act, that I think have made a difference, or at least can make a difference. The first, you had this bill in 2020, where Congress attempted to establish the first set of federal standards for DoD's PFAS incineration and say, before you incinerate, you have to comply with the following requirements. And then when DoD ignored that, they imposed an additional kind of provision in the 2022. So this is fiscal year 2022. It passed, I believe, last December, where Congress said, no, we meant it. Kind of, you can't just continue to ignore this. And they imposed a moratorium on DoD's incineration of PFAS-containing firefighting foam and certain other PFAS-containing wastes until DoD issues guidance complying with the 2020 NDA requirements. So right now, for the first time, I mean, really ever, DoD is not permitted to incinerate AFFF nationwide. Kind of, there is a current federal moratorium. They can still incinerate certain other PFAS containing wastes, and certainly other parties can continue to incinerate the firefighting foam and PFAS containing waste. So PFAS incineration is still a huge problem, but DoD has acknowledged that it has to stop, at least temporarily, its AFFF incineration. And what I think now is critical is making this moratorium meaningful, not just have it be a check the box exercise where DoD issues guidance saying, oh, don't worry, everything's fine. There are a couple of laboratory studies which suggest that the following temperature may be good enough for certain PFAS. So we're going to go back to our old incineration practices. But this is really an opportunity to force kind of a broader consideration of what technologies exist and are under development that really do provide better protection of public health and the environment. What is more effective at breaking down PFAS? And how can we, kind of to the extent that we need to dispose of this firefighting foam and other PFAS containing wastes, do so in a way that is health protective and equitable? And I think this moratorium provides an opportunity for that discussion. And one thing which I'm interested in discussing a little bit more later on, I want to wrap up because I know I'm probably at my time, but just I want to talk about how we can work together to kind of make use of this current moment and to ensure that, at least for the Department of Defense, they're not just rushing back to kind of their business as usual practices, but that we can kind of bring pressure to have them issue guidance that really recognizes the incredible harms associated with PFAS incineration and other irresponsible PFAS disposal, and sets them and the nation on a path towards more responsible, more equitable, and more health protective solutions. So that is all that I have, but thank you, and I'm happy to answer questions at the end.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was great. I really appreciate it. While we're switching slides, I want to introduce our second speaker, who's Cheryl Costa at Clean Air Taunton. Sherry's someone I had the pleasure of meeting only as we started to plan this event. It's been great to get to know you. Sherry is a self-described soccer and rugby mom with a JD from Suffolk Law School in Boston. She's passionate about issues of environmental justice and the benefits to a healthy home, work, and natural environment. She served on the Taunton City Council as a city councilor and as a conservation commissioner. Sherry's a member of Clean Air Taunton, as we mentioned, which is a community-based organization, and it's grateful for the support it gets from Clean Water Action, the Coalition for Social Justice, and the Conservation Law Foundation. Sherry, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. I'm just going to share my screen here. So thank you to the Cancer-Free Economy Network, CHEJ, and the Sierra Club for hosting the symposium, and all the sponsors. Thank you to all of you who are participating, the organizers, the presenters, and especially to everyone listening. My name is Cheryl Costa Hanlon. I'm a proud member of a organization called Clean Air Taunton. And as you can see from my slide, we are an association of residents, workers, and public health organizations mobilizing to stop the construction of a gasification plant in our city, Taunton, Massachusetts. And I'd like to just start with a story, as we are all environmental people. This is a recycled story. I don't own this story, but I think it really speaks to what's going on here in Taunton, and particularly with Clean Air Taunton. So the story goes like this. There's a woman, and she's stuck down in a hole. and she can look up and she can see people walking by. And so she calls for help and she says, can you please help me? I don't know how to get out of here. And a faith leader stops and says, oh, I can help you. And the faith leader writes a prayer and sends it down to her. And she prays on the prayer, and it calms her, but it doesn't get her out. And so she calls out again, and someone walking by is a doctor. And she says, can you please help me out of this hole? And the doctor says, and looks around and says, here, I'll write you a prescription, hands it to her and says, perhaps this will help. And the prescription for meditation helped the woman calm, but didn't help her out of the hole. And so lastly, she calls out again. She says, can you please help me? And the person looks down and jumps into the hole with her. And the woman says, what are you doing? Now we're both in the hole. And the woman looks at her, the other person looks at her and says, I'm your neighbor, and I've been here, and I know how to get out of this hole. And that's what I feel like we're doing with Clean Air in Taunton. We are working together with organizations like the Mass Nurses Association, like Clean Water, like the Coalition for Social Justice, like the Taunton High School African American Club, like True Diversity, Taunton Diversity Network, and the Coalition for Social Justice, and our local leaders to stop this gasification plant. And so if we can move to the next slide, I'll present why Taunton, right? Why is this Aries project being proposed in Taunton? A project that's supposed to incinerate 470 tons of sludge biosolids per day, when Taunton only generates 80. And I think you'll recognize the demographics of Taunton, and I think you'll recognize the issues that we face and see why Taunton, right? So Taunton is made up of about 57,000 people. And Taunton, for the longest time, had a very small manufacturing base, but that manufacturing base was silver, right? Reed and Barton is right down the street from my house. And there were two other silver manufacturers. And as we all know, silver, the production of silver was quite toxic, not only to the workers, but to our environment in the city of Taunton. And in the 70s and 80s, when we finally started getting environmental regulations to protect our workers and protect our environment, these places closed down. And so from an economic standpoint, Taunton was suffering like a lot of small cities, right, all over our country. And they were suffering. And as a result, the tax base was lowered. So things like our water treatment, our sewer treatment, and our municipal landfill were not invested into. So what happened was in the 80s, our municipal landfill was basically privatized. So a private entity took it over, and basically this is the need and greed model that we hear about so much, right? So a lower income community needs to have this investment, and in comes a private entity. So this private entity offered to manage the landfill, and Taunton would be able to dispose of its municipal solid waste for free and get a little bit of, get some money every year if they were allowed to basically dump everyone's trash in our landfill. And that's exactly what happened. And lo and behold, our landfill was closed in 2019 because it was just too large, right? One of the ways we dealt with our sewer sludge was to simply landfill it in our municipal landfill. And now we cannot do that. So here's the need. And here's a community that often struggles with investing in long-term projects, and in comes Aries and says, here we are the solution to your need. And so the mayor and a majority of city councilors, seeing the need, don't look behind the curtain, right? And see that the Aries is proposing this project, which will take care of our sludge, allegedly, and also, again, put some money into the pockets. You would think that we would learn, but clearly we have not learned. So the Aries project gets basically green lighted at the local level, mostly by the mayor and a small amount of our city council. And so people started hearing about it slowly. And I just wanted to take a minute to tell you who Ares is. So Ares is they call themselves a clean technology company. And in 2010, they say that they developed this process for taking wood to biochar and then to energy. So they built a very small plant in Lebanon, Texas. Tennessee. They're based in Tennessee. And so from this little plant, they morphed into this larger entity, and mostly through the funding of what is being touted as green investment money, but I would submit to you is not green at all. And I will say, and I'm saying names today, so we'll be speaking names. Spring Lane Capital as a private equity fund that is funding Ares, right from Boston. So Spring Lane Capital infuses this amount of money into what Ares is saying is a gasification technology that destroys PFAS. That is their selling point. That's what they're selling. And so they have built the exact model of what they want to do in Taunton in a place called Linden, New Jersey. The difference with the Linden, New Jersey plant is exactly right next to the sewer treatment plant for the county, and they will be taking 450 tons per day of the sewer treatment plant and supposedly going through this process where they gasify it and allegedly destroy PFAS. That's what they want to put in Taunton. However, in Taunton, they'll only be using 20 tons of municipal solid waste. The other 20 tons of biosolid sludge. The other 450, who knows where that's coming from? And it's extremely they're not open and honest about their process. They won't even tell us where the stream is coming from. So it caused some concern. And I want you, there's community organizing around the Linden plant. From community, and I put them in here, the Iron Communities Coalition, and we wish them the best, and we hope people here will support them. So when the Ares proposal came down, people were kind of taken aback, and so we started the Clean Air Taunton, and now now we have a pause in the plan for Ares. And the reason we have a pause, and you can go to the next slide, please. The reason we have a pause in this is because of the hard work of Clean Air Taunton and all of these organizations. And again, I want to name names because it's so important to me. I mean, Lisa from Massachusetts Nurses Association, Sabrina from the Coalition on Social Justice, Elizabeth from Clean Water Action, Tanya from True Diversity, April from Taunton Diversity Network, Condoleezza from the Taunton High School African American Student Organization, and Kirsty from Conservation Law Foundation. Those people have uplifted us as neighbors to give us what we need to get organized, to meet every week, to focus our attention on educating our neighbors and also reaching out to state and local officials. And I will tell you, the Clean Water canvas, those young people canvas, this is not, some of them don't even live in this community, and they canvass every Thursday, and they are wonderful. And so when people talk about this generation or whatever they say, I remember those young people canvassing on our behalf to make sure that this community is not contaminated with PFAS. And I also want to say that we've gotten help from a small group of our local elected officials. They are small, but they are mighty. Okay, we have Estelle Borges, who is our city councilor, who is the chair of the Solid Waste Committee. She was a former councilor. She was just elected again in January, and she took on this process and basically pulled the curtain back on what was really going on. And I will speak briefly about what caused the pause and what was really going on. Our president of the city council, Phil Duat, who has an undergraduate degree in public health, called this process out immediately, and has been vocal about it. Our local and Barry Sanders is another city councilor who has originally, you know, thought that this was a good idea and has since educated himself and realized that it's not. And then our state officials who I cannot speak more highly of, our state representative, Carol Doherty. Our state has a very strong environmental justice law that's been very helpful to us. And Carol and our state senator, Mark Pacheco, were key in getting that. But I have to say, our saving grace is our state senator, Mark Pacheco. This is a man who has fought on environmental justice issues, climate issues for decades, and he saw this coming. And part of the reason we have this pause in the Aries plan is for two reasons. Because Aries is supposedly rectifying or addressing a municipal sludge issue, and they're basically contracting with the city, there are certain requirements for a request for proposal to be sent out so that there could be fair bidding. That was not done properly in this particular process. The second issue is the site of this proposed project is on the old landfill. So it's basically grandfathered because it used to be a landfill. That's what the state is saying. However, because it's public property, again, there was supposed to be a more open, transparent process about quote unquote leasing this property to Aries. That was not done properly. And those two critical issues were brought forward by Senator Mark Pacheco. And as a result, the Inspector General of the state of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and I would ask everyone, get to know your Inspector Generals, because these people, if you're dealing with anything that has to have any kind of municipal oversight or governmental oversight, these are the people you want to talk to. They don't pull punches. They go by, they checklist the law, and they make sure that these public-private, you know, so-called public-private projects go the way that they're supposed to go. So we are so blessed. We're so fortunate to have these advocates, and Clean Air Taunton is blessed with not only and so fortunate to have the people that we have, not just the elected officials at the state level, and not just our community organizations, but our neighbors. And we meet every Wednesday, and we know, you know, my neighbors, some of them work in Boston. Most of them have other responsibilities, family work, and we're here for each other, and we're going strong. And the bottom line is, this may be paused, but we still have so much work to do. And so I thank you for allowing us to just give you an overview of what we're dealing with. And thank you for your time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sherry. We are a little slow, so I'm going to speed through my introduction of Cheryl Sommer, who's with the United Congregations of Metro East. She's the board president, and UCM is a faith-based coalition that advances social and environmental justice issues in the East St. Louis area of Illinois. Cheryl's a lead role in the battle against the nearby Veolia incinerator at CHEJ, and she'll tell you more about her work. Cheryl has spent the majority of her adult life working in the church-based ministry and is passionate about the potential that congregations in all faiths have in being agents of social change and environmental justice. Thanks so much for joining us today, Cheryl.
Hey, thank you for inviting me to be here. Thank you for sponsoring this event. I'm just going to speed right into my talk. I'm the dummy of the group. I'm really grateful for smart people like John and Jane and Sonia, and we really benefited from them. I'm just an ordinary person. And my entry into the troubled world of PFAS came in early 2020 through my UCM work. We're a community organizing group in the East St. Louis region. We discovered that a hazardous waste incinerator near us was one of about a dozen incinerators listed as approved sites for the incineration of PFAS containing firefighting foam from the DoD. At that time, I only had a vague knowledge that something related to Teflon was in the bodies of just about everyone on the planet, and that it was somehow harmful. And I had gotten that from an NPR segment that I was only half listening to one time. We'd already been in the fight with this waste incinerator known as Veolia Environmental Solutions. That was over their sweetheart deal that they had lobbied with EPA head Scott Pruitt. That deal rolled back a host of air quality regulations for this major air polluter just outside the border of East St. Louis, a city where 96% of the population is Black. While we didn't win that fight, we had become known in the community. Thus, when Jane and John were looking for an organization in our region to join a lawsuit against DOD, we were a logical choice. Before saying yes, we did a little research, and that included watching the movies The Devil We Know and Dark Waters. We were aghast to find out that PFAS was the most toxic human-made substance ever and by humans, and that its numerous effects included cancer and suppressed immune systems and resistance to immunizations. We were concerned to learn that there were stockpiles of AFFF containing PFAS that were leaching into the soil in many places where it was stored and ending up in groundwater. And that included the discovery of PFAS in groundwater near Scott Air Force Base, which was also in our area. We were appalled to learn that our government thought that putting a fire suppressant like PFAS in an incinerator would safely destroy it when there was no evidence that it would. So right before the pandemic began, we had our first public meeting to tell people about the danger of PFAS. And to create a dramatic effect, we thought it'd be cute to wear masks. Bad idea. We wore masks for the next 2 years. But we wanted to show how serious what they wanted to put in our air was. For the lawsuit, we needed to choose one of our members as a declarant to tell how DOD's action was putting them in danger. Ms. Cozy, an 80-year-old UCM leader who was raising 3 of her great-grandchildren, immediately stepped forward. They lived just a mile away from the incinerator, and they were already dealing with breathing problems and some strange neurological ailments. Besides that, Ms. Cozy's moral character was impeccable, and she still had a lot of fight in her. Her story was the right story to include in the lawsuit, and it was a story that also grabbed the attention of the news media when the lawsuit was announced. That started a little more conversation in the general public. While we waited for the lawsuit to play out, we decided to follow the example of our allies in New York, who got legislation passed banning PFAS incineration in a small geographic area around Cohoes. We decided that we were going to work to get legislation banning the incineration of all PFAS in our entire state. Unfortunately, with the pandemic shelter-in-place order, the Illinois legislators met very briefly that year, and they only dealt with the most urgent matters, and PFAS wasn't an urgent issue yet for most people. So nothing happened in 2020, and nothing happened with the lawsuit either. But Ms. Cozy kept telling her story, and the rest of us kept talking too. Slowly, we were starting to get some traction. In 2021, along with our Sierra Club allies, we were successful in getting our representative to sponsor legislation that we wrote out for her. All she had to do was introduce it. That banned the incineration of PFAS throughout the whole state. We started holding meetings with a bunch of state representatives from both parties who were in the 80-mile radius of the incinerator. None of them knew anything about PFAS until we talked to them. Of course, Ms. Cozy told her story at a committee hearing for our bill, and it was unanimously voted out of committee. In May 2021, our bill unanimously passed both the Illinois House and Senate. We were overjoyed that the obstacle of ignorance on the issue had been overcome. Sadly, a couple months later, we discovered another obstacle. The Illinois Manufacturers Association, who represented a 3M plant in the state that manufactured firefighting foam, had gotten to the governor and asked him to veto the bill. The IMA told the governor that they were requesting a veto so there could be a minor change in the bill, that of removing thermal oxidation from the definition of incineration. They claimed that without that change, a large number of jobs would be lost at the plant. A greatly exaggerated statement, but hey, if you're the governor who's up for re-election, you don't want to be accused of killing jobs. The governor promised that if we agreed to the minor change, he would urge that the bill be passed and signed into law in the veto session. Unfortunately, the veto session was shortened and our bill didn't get passed. So we were back to the drawing board again in 2022. Now the Illinois Manufacturers Association had even more time to get to our legislators and weaken our bill. At this point, we learned that there were an estimated 5,000 PFAS substances. The number kept growing because PFAS manufacturers were constantly tweaking the structure of PFAS every time a certain type of PFAS got banned. Our original bill was written so as to ban the incineration of any type of PFAS. Unfortunately, the IMA was ultimately successful in persuading our legislator to introduce a bill that banned the incineration of only PFAS named on the EPA toxics release inventory, about 180 PFAS. That bill got bipartisan support and again, unanimously passed the entire legislature this spring. We expect the governor to sign it this time. Obviously, the bad news is that about 4,820 PFAS can still be incinerated in Illinois, but there's a lot of good news here too. First, at a time when DOD and private companies are trying to get stockpiles of PFAS waste off of their liability, our bill will prevent some of the most concentrated and harmful PFAS waste from being incinerated in Illinois. Second, additional PFAS are added to the EPA toxics release inventory each year. So that will help us chisel away at some of those other 4,800 PFAS. And third, in a state that is as partisanly divided as any, a bill banning the incineration of some bad PFAS passed unanimously. To me, that means any state could pass a ban on PFAS incineration if legislators are educated well. Key for us in being able to pass the legislation were four things. First was our allies. Earthjustice got this launched by filing a lawsuit. The media helped us get the word out. The Sierra Club provided us with some accurate research on the science and government policies, and local grassroots organizations like environmental and racial justice activists and universities helped us engage more people. Second was the power of story in moving minds and hearts. Facts are very important, but they don't move hearts. And without moving hearts, it's hard to get the traction needed to pass legislation. Ms. Cozy was a person whose story stuck with legislators. Third, we had to educate people about the problem of PFAS. Most legislators and ordinary citizens didn't have any idea that this was going on, and until they were appalled, the issue didn't move. Besides the movies I mentioned earlier, we also found out that comedians were starting to use their platform to raise awareness. Our state representative didn't really get passionate about PFAS until she saw John Oliver's segment on PFAS last October. And fourth, we needed to be prepared for resistance from groups like the Illinois Manufacturers Association, who tried to manipulate the facts. So we were really grateful for Sonia's and Jane's help with the facts and just countering all the misinformation that inevitably got out there. So even though most people still don't know it, the need to properly dispose of PFAS is an urgent public health issue. The PFAS industry is aggressively working to reduce their liability and dispose of their PFAS waste as quickly, quietly, and easily as possible. We have to be vigilant and work together to make sure that safe disposal techniques are created as soon as possible. So thank you for the opportunity to share our story and for your help in doing what you can do on this huge problem.
Thank you so much. That was great to hear. Our last speaker today will be Jane Williams. Jane is the Executive Director of California Communities Against Toxics. CCAT works to protect communities from industrial pollutants. Jane carries on a legacy from her mother, environmentalist Norma Stormy Gale Williams, who also worked in a similar vein to protect people and the environment from pollution. Thank you so much, Jane, for joining us.
Thank you. And thank you to the other panelists for doing such a great job. I'm going to talk about a few things today. I was asked to talk about landfills, but the other panelists know that I've been very involved in the anti-incineration campaign. And my many years of working on the destruction of chemical weapons, where we developed new technologies, non-incineration technologies for the destruction of our nation's chemical weapons, has really informed the debate around what to do with these perfluorinated compounds. So I just wanted to sort of say as an introduction to my presentation, these compounds are very tightly bound and extremely mobile and very toxic. And so those things make them unique. They're similar to PCBs, except that they're highly mobile. So when you put them in the environment, they quickly end up in water, and then they bioconcentrate into fish like mercury does and PCBs do, and end up in breast milk and cord blood. And that's why, they're preferentially deposited in the ocean. So they're really, truly a global pollutant and very, very difficult to take apart. And so that's why I don't actually use the word disposal. I use the word destruction, because you can't really put them anywhere. Once you put them someplace, they end up in the water wherever you put them, including in incinerators. When you incinerate these compounds, you can actually find them depositing next to where the incineration is taking place and then going into the groundwater. So that's why it's incredibly important to find destruction technologies and use those and fund those to actually destroy the compounds. Second only, of course, to turning the tap off, as Dr. Birnbaum talked about, right? We have to stop making these compounds, just like we have to stop making PCBs and DDT and other persistent organic pollutants. Okay, next slide. So California has one of the most extensive testing programs in the country. And this is the summary of what we have found so far in California. As you can well see, that we're basically focusing on pieces of the petrochemical infrastructure, bulk fuel terminals and refineries, and then airports where AFFF is used, where fuel is stored. Chrome platers are a huge problem in California. We have lots and lots of chrome platers, and they're all in environmental justice communities, and most of the groundwater has been contaminated. And a lot of the releases from chrome platers are going into publicly operated treatment works, which ends up that's how biosolids, one of the ways in which biosolids get contaminated with PFAS is from chrome plating. So then you can see landfills, and then obviously publicly operated treatment works. So this just gives you a quick down and dirty, how much of a problem is it? And you can see that wastewater from landfills are very contaminated. Okay, next slide. So Colorado is the only place I know of where we're adopting wastewater treatment standards for refineries. So kudos to the folks in Colorado that are pushing that forward. Basically, here in California, we were unsuccessful in getting PFAS added to some of our stormwater our stormwater permits at Chrome Platers. And so that's a future project of ours. Okay, next slide. Chrome plating, paper mills, plastics manufacturing, textile, and rug manufacturing all use perfluorinated compounds. And the addition of PFAS to plastics, huge problem when you go to recycle them or reuse plastic. And I know some of you may be following the plastics campaign and the efforts to get an international treaty on plastics. And this is PFAS contamination is one of the main reasons that basically plastics is not recyclable. So controlling legacy pollution from industrial sites, whether it's from wastewater or stormwater or contaminated soils, which is what the Moose Creek incinerator is mainly burning now, which is contaminated soils, the incinerator that Pam talked about. All of these ideas about how we're just going to move PFAS around is really like moving the chairs around the Titanic, right? Moving the deck chairs around, because we have found that there is just a huge number of crazy disposal options occurring. Incineration is one of them, open burning, AFFF, in Beatty, Nevada at a hazardous waste landfill, matrixing AFFF with cement and putting it in a hazardous waste landfill next to the Snake River in Idaho. Deep well injection is one of the probably the cheapest, least expensive way of getting rid of PFAS. And of course, PFAS is highly mobile in the subsurface. So you can just imagine what happens when you try to deep well inject that stuff. Okay, next slide. So PFAS leaking from current and closed landfills. So landfills leak actually the moment that they're created. The way in which the liner systems are put together is they are welded with heat. And so you can imagine like trying to take two pieces of cloth and put them on top of each other, and take a giant iron and put some double sticky tape on there and trying to believe that those two pieces of cloth would somehow hold water. That's how the landfill liners are created in modern landfills. And so as soon as they're welded, they leak. So the landfill leachate is, here in California, where we've looked at groundwater underneath landfills, we have not found a landfill that is not contaminated with groundwater contamination from PFAS. And our landfill investigation has been one of the most consistent and robust in the country. So when you're pumping the leachate out from the landfill, a lot of that leachate actually goes to publicly operated treatment works, similar to PFAS from chrome platers. And that's some of the reasons that we believe we find such high levels of contamination in biosolids. So the leachate is a really, really nasty thing. There's really nothing to do with it. Right now, it probably should just be re-injected in the landfill, but we're hoping in the future that we'll have supercritical water oxidation, or there's some new enzyme technologies that folks are looking at. But without an actual destruction technology, you can't, again, you're sort of moving the deck chairs around the Titanic by just trying to put it someplace else. So next slide. So lots of PFAS in closed landfills. Here's a great slide from Minnesota. I don't know what percentage of landfills in Minnesota have been tested, but you can see from this slide that lots, in California, every landfill is contaminated. So next slide. So here's New York, data from New York, tested groundwater at only closed landfills, not existing operating ones. So you can get an idea of what you're seeing. Now remember, whenever you look at PFAS testing, you're looking at the stars in the sky, but the dark matter is missing, right? I don't know if we've done any total organic fluorine testing for groundwater underneath closed landfills, but normally the existing water testing methods just pick up, less than 10% of the total organic loading of groundwater contamination. Some cases it could be a little bit higher depending on what the source is. So these are just for PFAS and PFOA, and then for 1,4-dioxane. So it just basically gives you the idea again that all the landfills are contaminated, all the groundwater. Next slide. So states committed to landfill assessment and cleanup. This has Minnesota. California also is committed to landfill assessment and cleanup as well. It's the only other state that I know. And our numbers are basically for PFAS and PFOA and PFHXS at the detection limit of the method. And I think for PFNA as well. So these intervention limits, when you look at these numbers, you can see that the higher chain, the longer chains are really at the detection limit. These are parts per trillion. So that just gives you an idea of how incredibly toxic these compounds are. They're really, as toxic as plutonium. Next slide. So current options, bad. Don't send it to wastewater treatment plants because it ends up in the biosolids. And don't dispose of it on land. You're just spreading it around like peanut butter. Deep well injection is less awful. Re-injection into the landfill is just as an interim measure. It's more like re-injecting leachate into a landfill is more like a storage option than a disposal option. The best thing to do would be to, capture the PFAS from the leachate, try to separate it out. Maybe, I'm not sure exactly what we could use with that because you've got all these other contaminants like 1,4-dioxane and just a whole raft of different things, and then just store it. So right now, I think in California, what we are doing is re-injecting, taking the leachate out, putting it back in until EPA can approve some sort of actual destruction method. So next slide. So EPA, we have a guidance document due in the fall of next year. EPA through its PIT team, which is its PFAS Innovation and Treatment Technology team, has and is still looking at different technologies. We wanted them to look specifically at supercritical water oxidation because it had been used successfully to destroy chemical warfare agents, which many are also fluorine-based. So we felt that that could be promising. And so far, it is promising. I think that there's going to be another panel on destruction technology, so I don't want to get too far into that. But one of the key components or the key challenges are with any destruction technology is monitorability. And so it's actually easier to test for PFAS and PFAS compounds and to test for total organic fluorine, so you know how much you're missing with your existing testing in water than it is in other media. And so that's been one of the significant problems that we found in the chemical weapons destruction technology campaign is that things are more difficult to find in the air than they are in water. And if you can keep stuff in water, then you can tank it. So you can understand what your destruction efficiency is because you can test for whatever you're trying to destroy and test for the breakdown products. If you've got it in water and you can store it in a tank, and then if you don't like your destruction efficiencies or for some reason you don't like your byproducts that were produced, you can test for those. So that's one of the lessons learned from the chemical weapons destruction campaign that we've done.